So I would just like to thank everyone for joining this session with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center's, online budget summit. So we are delighted to have attorneys from the Public Interest Law Center and Education Law Center here today, Michael Churchill and Christina Moon, to tell you about the school funding lawsuit. And I just wanted to lay down some ground rules. So everybody's muted right now, and our presenters will make their presentation. After they've made the presentation, they'll be taking questions from attendees. So you're invited to submit your questions via the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen on the Whova app. You may submit them now, during, and after the presentation so that the moderator, who's me, has them on hand and ready to go. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please indicate which one you'd like to have address your question. And if you'd like to ask your question directly, please note that, and then we can unmute you, and you can turn on your camera if you'd like, and you can ask your question directly. If you don't want to ask it directly, you can just type it in, and I will pose your question to the panel on your behalf. If you're having a technical issue, please send a message using the Whova chat feature, not the Q&A tool. So this presentation will last about an hour, including the Q&A. Any questions that we don't get a chance to answer during the session, we will make sure we get answered later because we have your contact information. The last 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to be talking about charter school reform. So without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Michael Churchill, an attorney with the Public Interest Law Center. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleague, Christina Moon. We need to start by saying we're part of large organizations that are putting together the lawsuit. We could not do this on our own. And you'll see information about our organizations, the Public Interest Law Center and Education Law Center on the screens. And if I could figure out how to make this thing click to the next one. There we go. There's the information. And we're going to go right into what is the long-term problem that makes Pennsylvania so inequitable, inadequate in its school funding. The first place to start is the fact that there's no goal of fully funding schools. When the legislature gets together to consider how much money they're going to appropriate for the year, they never ask what do the schools need. They don't take any polls. They don't take any investigation. It is really based on what is convenient for the legislature in whatever goals it may have that year in terms of the budget that it's making. So that's the first problem. It's never discussed. The second problem is the state's contribution to the cost of education is amongst the lowest in the country. And what that does is it means the reliance is on the local districts. And most of those districts have great variation in their ability to fund their schools. There is a formula that the state has developed, but to decide how much money of the pot that they are distributing should go to which school districts, but they don't use it for most of the money. And so the consequences of all this is that low wealth communities who have the greatest needs amongst their students, who tax the highest, try the hardest, they actually have the least amount to spend. So that's the problem. We're not the only ones to say it. The problem has been well defined. Here's one. Pennsylvania has significant financial inequities. I got to go back. They have financial inequities which affect all the students and are the greatest in the country, amongst the greatest. That's on the input side. And then similarly on the output side, it's been said the Commonwealth also has some of the most significant reading and achievement gaps between low-income students and students of color with their more white and affluent peers. This isn't just the advocates, though, who are saying this. This comes from the state itself in its Every Student Succeeds Act consolidated state plan. And what's really important is that the problems that Pennsylvania have are not a mystery. They're out there in public documents and for everyone to see. It's just that no one has bothered to do anything about it for a very, very long time. So let's get to the actual facts. Here is the percentage of contribution the states, each state makes to their education funding. Pennsylvania is about 38%. The last time we had any figures, it's probably gotten a little lower. And as long as I've been looking at these, Pennsylvania has been either third to seventh lowest in the country. We are an outlier. We're always relying heavily on our local districts for funding. And let me show you the problem. If I can get my screen here to move off, there we go. This shows all of the districts in Delaware County. And you'll see that they have, the second column is their tax burden. This is how the state measures the contribution and the burden on the taxpayers. Equalized mills are basically a fancy way of saying a percentage. If you moved it over 1 point, it would be the actual percentage of market value. Marple Newtown, which is the lowest in the county, has 13 equalized mills. That means it's 1.3%. And for $100,000 of market value, it means the homeowner would pay about $1,300. With a tax rate, which is the lowest in the county, they're able to raise $21,000 per student. If you go to the bottom of the list, William Penn School District is taxing 2.5 times higher, 34 mills, 3.4%. But the problem is, even with that higher tax rate, they are able to raise only $8,800. To give you a little context, Philadelphia's is 24 mills, and the state median is about 18.8. So there's wide disparities in almost every county. Delaware County is really typical in that regard. So how does it play out? Now, these are not typical. We're going to look at New Hope, which is one of the most well-funded districts in Bucks County, and Reading, which is one of the poorest of our small cities. And in New Hope, the tax rate is 12.6 mils, 1.2%. That raises $25,000 in revenue. It's really rich. The state puts in $4,600, and the total amount is $30,000 per child. Now you turn to Reading, and the tax rate is double, but the revenue is only a tenth, $2,500. The state is progressive. It gives more. It gives $10,000 to them, but it doesn't begin to make up for the difference. It's $13,000, leaving you a $16,000 difference. Now, this is extreme, but it is true throughout the state. And the problem is that not only do you have this difference in income, but you have to ask yourself, who really needs more? New Hope only has less than 10% of its students in poverty. Reading has 95% of its students in poverty. New Hope has less than 3% English language learners. Reading has 26%. And everybody knows, I think it's well known, that if you're coming out of poverty, if you're an English language learners, the cost to the district to begin to prepare you to be successful is much higher. So this is just to remind you that one of the problems is that so much of the school funding that comes out of the state is really based on what happened in 1991, because from 1991 until 1915, there were only 3 years in which the state actually had a formula. The rest of the time, the state essentially gave everybody the same percentage increase based on what they had in 1991 in each subsequent year, or with some very modest small other additions. But essentially, everyone was just getting what they got before, plus a little something, with very little change. And to remind you how long ago that was, here's Michelle Gorbachev, President Bush, Barack Obama when he's still a law student, and LeBron James when he was not yet in high school. That was a long time ago. So in 2015, actually, from the Budget Commission, the state decided to enact a formula that would actually look at what students and what districts need. And so it uses what is called weighted students. It takes into account the actual number of students, hooray, whether they're in poverty, whether they're in concentrated poverty, and whether they're English language learners. The problem with it is they didn't, say, and based on this, how much should they have? It's just a formula to divide the current pie or whatever pie the state says will exist. So it purposely excluded asking how much is needed. It turns, therefore, everything into a zero-sum game. How much of the pie are we going to get? And it only applies the new formula to the amounts since the formula was adopted, since 2016, 15. And so that means the inequities that existed before are locked in. Currently, it's only 11% of the basic education formula funding that runs through the formula. There's about 1.5 billion of inequity based into this. This is the reason why the governor has suggested that we have to have a way of fixing the problem. The problem is, well, because we're locked into, at the moment, what might be called the Hunger Games syndrome of everybody fighting for the pie that is there. The consequences of this hold harmless is enormous hurt to particularly a wide range of small cities. Approximately 166 districts are getting less than they should. Here are the ones that are the highest on a per student basis. York at $5,726, and you can go down the list. Philadelphia is not even on the top 10 in a per student basis. The problem and why we don't get this fixed is because on the other side, there are 340 districts, some of whom have substantial amounts more than the formula tells you they would get. And the problem with turning this into a hunger game is that many of these quote unquote overfunded districts by the formula are actually not receiving the amounts that they need because they are, while they're getting more state money than they need, they have small and very poor resources to put into the pot, just as you saw from the example of Reading. Therefore, they can't afford to have the money sort of taken away from them. And it was only with the governor's proposal that we finally got away from the question of, is it time to take money away without actually fixing the problem in some way? Now, you could either fix it by using a new form of hold harmless, of making the losers, bringing them back up to what they had, or you can do it more slowly and have a sort of leveling up process of giving extra money to the districts that are behind. The one thing you can't do is what the state has chosen to do, which is bury its head in the sand and do nothing. Why does all of this inequity and inadequacy matter? Well, because we have schools and students going to schools with mold, asbestos, and other problems that directly affects them. And of course, we have outcomes which are really painful to see when essentially you have in math 8th grade scores of more than 2/3 of your students below proficient and more than almost 40% below basic. You really have a problem in outcomes. The Keystones are a little better, but they're still far from what anyone would think was the adequate outcomes we'd want. And if we want to look at whether people really are college and career ready, the college and attendance is really rates in the low spending, low wealth districts are way behind where they are for the well-funded districts. And it's not just because they have low-income students. One of the things that this litigation has revealed that's not commonly known is that low-income students from the wealthy, well-spending districts are doing much better in terms of both college attendance and college graduation than they are when they attend low-funded districts. Not surprising. So what has been going on? Has there been any improvement in the last 6 years? The governor, as you may recall, came in with hopes that he would have $2 billion of increases in the first 4 years. Instead, what we have seen is $700 million of increases in 6 years. If you include and look at it in terms of inflation, there's been a decline of $100 million. We're falling behind. And if you look at the gaps between what the high wealth and the low wealth districts can spend, those gaps have been increasing over this time also. So that's the problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christina.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just going to take a moment to switch our screen share. Paul or somebody on my team, can you tell me if we're good? Okay, great. All right. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I know you've been involved in a dynamic conference, and we're excited to share this information with you. As Michael explained all of the problems existing in our funding system, my section of the presentation will talk about our lawsuit and how we hope to address those problems through the lawsuit. So our case, the William Penn School District, the Pennsylvania Department of Education and others, was first filed in November 2014. So we've been in this fight for a long time. It was filed in the Commonwealth Court because that's where we're required to file since we're suing the state actors. The Pennsylvania Constitution is quoted here, and it says that the General Assembly is responsible for ensuring a thorough and efficient system of public education. As Michael explained earlier, the reality facing our students in schools is they don't have the resources they need to meet state standards and participate meaningfully in the economy and our democracy. And our lawsuit really has two different pieces to it. We are alleging that the funding system is inadequate because the state does not provide school districts with the resources they need for students to actually meet those academic standards set by the state and the PSSA and the Keystones, and to be able to be college or career ready. And we also allege the funding system is inequitable because the way that funding is distributed by the state creates these outrageous disparities between the school districts, like the examples that Michael shared. So, good, slides are working. Our petitioners in the case, this case is brought on behalf of 4 families and 6 school districts from across Pennsylvania and 2 statewide organizations, the NAACP and the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. And we also highlight the School District of Philadelphia through a parent petitioner. The respondents, we're suing the state actors responsible for the school funding system. So that's the leaders of the Pennsylvania Senate and the House of Representatives, the governor and the State Department of Education and the State Board of Education. The remedy, what we're asking the court to do is to declare the current broken system of school funding unconstitutional and to direct the legislature to create a constitutional funding system. So that means that the legislature will need to increase the amount of money provided by the state to schools, and they'll need to ensure that additional funds are driven to districts that are serving students who have the most significant needs. So in our case, that means we need to prove what is the constitutional standard, and is that being college and career ready? Is that proficiency under the academic standards that the state has set? How have we met it? How will you know what measures do we need to meet? And does it require more money to meet it? Or is it some other factor at fault here? And under the equal protection part of our case, is there any possible justification for these vast disparities? Respondents on the other side really try to distract with comparison of Pennsylvania to other states across the country, but on some select measures. But our case is really about our state constitution and what it obligates our state leaders to do for our Pennsylvania students. And as was evident in the earlier slides, we know our students are not getting what they need to succeed. The funding formula is an acknowledgement of the funding required to meet some challenges of poverty and district sparsity and English learners, et cetera. But as Michael explained, the state has not actually put the majority of funding through that formula. So the existence of the formula in our system as it's currently enacted or implemented is certainly not fixed the problem. And then the last two bullets here really kind of seek to put the blame elsewhere on anybody but the commonwealth by blaming students or parents or outside factors instead of taking the constitutional obligation on the state to provide a thorough and efficient system of education. Where are we now? Throughout 2020, we engaged in significant discovery, exchanged over 100,000 pages of documents. We deposed over 70 witnesses. We exchanged between the parties expert reports and then rebuttal reports on those expert reports. And we have through our experts, financial breakdown of the state funding system, an overview, and really looking at how different cohorts of students receive different pockets of money throughout the districts and their outcomes. We also have experts studying, sharing studies about how money matters and the impact that it has on student outcomes and the larger economy. And we also have experts talking about what are those effective interventions and the factors that we know work if only we invest in them. We also most recently were successful in defeating 2 summary judgment motions. Those are an attempt by the other side to say certain claims or parties can't go forward. We were successful in getting an order from the judge that the State Board of Education, for example, is an indispensable party. They will have some role in any remedy that's ordered, and that 2 parents of our graduated students are not mooted out because, as the judge said, this is a case of real public importance. So we do, in fact, expect a trial this year in 2021. So another piece that we'll show through our litigation is that these inequities between race and class are really dramatic and really unacceptable. As this first slide, Pennsylvania school districts are among the most segregated by race and class lines of anywhere in the nation. And indeed, districts with more white students receive more money. Districts with more Black and Latinx students receive less money, and it's not by little. One study found the difference was almost $2,000 per student. We also address really countering a narrative from the other side that suggests really offensively that some students can't learn, that maybe not everybody can make progress. But really the research is clear that despite the fact that, or while living in poverty without resources and supports can indeed have a big impact on development and achievement. And so it's important that our policies recognize that and address it. It is also clear how we address it. The research shows there are academic outcomes improve when schools have resources for proven interventions like high quality preschool and smaller class sizes, highly trained teachers, sufficient school counselors to support kids at all levels, not just triaging a crisis, and social workers and community liaisons to connect families with external resources and services. And it really is that money invested in these interventions enable students living in poverty to meaningfully engage with that curriculum and make that academic progress. As Michael said, that's evidenced also by data that economically disadvantaged students attending schools with more resources in wealthier communities do better. So how much do districts need? Well, in fact, the state law has set a formula for calculating the resources that schools need so that students have a shot at reaching their state academic standards. The law says that the state should calculate how much school districts need to reach this target each year, but the state has not done so for years. So our expert did the work and calculated the numbers. And we found that according to the state's formula, 277 of Pennsylvania's districts need more than $2,000 more per student to adequately support their students and graduate them ready to compete in today's economy. Altogether, according to the formula in state law, that brings districts' statewide need to $4.6 billion more invested over time to adequately educate our kids. And you can check out the gaps. That there is a breakdown per school district at the website fundourschoolspa.org. And somebody can put that in the chat for an immediate link out for each district, what the shortfall, what the gap is for each district. This is just breakdown by particular districts. I wanted to note that this is actually a conservative estimate, the 4.6 billion. It could really be higher if we took in consideration that academic standards now used are more rigorous than what was in place when this was originally instituted. There are, of course, increasing costs for teacher pensions and charter costs that districts bear. And there are additional weights that were added in the basic education formula that in recognition that some populations of students need even more supports to reach proficiency. So that proposal from Governor Wolf that Michael mentioned, in February, Governor Wolf proposed this historic investment of an additional $1.35 billion in basic ed funding and suggested that it be directed to underfunded schools with students that need it the most. There was also a $200 million earmarked for special education funds, also included pre-K and Head Start investments. And this is, in fact, the type of big investment that we need to increase the amount of money in the pie and distribute it more equitably. We would be thrilled to see it enacted. Unfortunately, Republican legislators have said that this proposal is dead on arrival. But whether it's Governor Wolf's proposal or sending all the state money through the formula, neither fixes the problem, because you'll remember that there are two, that there's not enough money and that it's not fairly distributed. So we need both big new investments like that which Governor Wolf proposed and a benchmark assessment from the state about what students actually need to be college and career ready, and an equitable distribution of those. So to address, the reality of the pandemic this past year, to state the obvious, it takes resources to respond to a pandemic. And of course, we saw stark differences in how districts were able to respond and support students when the coronavirus pandemic first closed school buildings. You'll see this, the date on this newspaper article, for example, is March 18th, which was just a few days after the school district closed buildings. And already it was clear these distinctions between which districts can serve and which were scrambling. So, you can imagine, and I'm sure some of you lived this, if a school already had enough money and previously provided all students with a laptop, they were better able to shift into virtual learning when necessary. And compared to the school that relied on sharing a single cart of 30 computers for an entire 9th grade of students that had to scramble to even get those one-to-one computers. And if a school previously had enough funding to upgrade their buildings or keep up with regular maintenance and can pay enough teachers to avoid class sizes of 30 in an old building, that school likely has a better chance of safely returning their students to a school that is well ventilated and able to physically distance students, compared to our schools that are still using very old buildings with poor ventilation, overcrowded classrooms before the pandemic. This is also clear in the resources required to support students and families in digital learning. Students need an adult at home able to navigate the school portal and the multiple digital learning platforms. English learners or parents who don't speak English and other families that did not have this digital literacy at home, or parents who are working multiple essential jobs in the pandemic. Schools that have resources like staff to make those individualized outreach were able to serve and support those students and families. And schools that did not have those resources still have significant kids missing learning during digital and hybrid models. So this pandemic has really only deepened the divide between schools that have enough to offer their students and schools that don't have the resources they need. The American Rescue Plan is, of course, the latest news in this front, and it's a historic federal stimulus to local governments and schools. $5 billion for schools in Pennsylvania so far. The bulk of those funds are going to schools through Title I, so that schools with the greatest need will get most of these funds. These are the schools that were the hardest hit and least equipped to pivot to online learning. And certainly Pennsylvania's Black and Brown students are concentrated in those low wealth districts and will get long overdue support from this plan. Of course, it is temporary and one-time federal funding. So that limits the ways that districts can responsibly spend the money or risk falling off what is referred to as a fiscal cliff when those federal funds are depleted and if they've built up a budget depending on continuing funds that they won't have. Some of those funds are required to be spent on supporting students' learning loss, and some districts certainly plan to address longstanding deficit gaps or building improvements. But when the next fiscal year rolls around, our underfunded districts will receive too little funds from the Pennsylvania legislature to meet those student needs. So while this is necessary and welcome in this crisis, it doesn't fix the long-term problems that come from our Pennsylvania state leaders' failure to create a system of public school funding that prepares our students for success, regardless of their zip code or poverty level or race. So what can our lawsuit accomplish? Studies actually show that funding lawsuits like ours, which have taken place across the country in other states, do bring about more revenue than a state would otherwise have raised and can increase the academic achievement and lifetime success of students. And really what we see this as necessary to do is to break that political impasse over funding by getting an independent review from the court to the legislators and other state actors. So we need your help because even if we get what we are asking the court to do, which is, to declare the current system unconstitutional and to direct the legislature to fix it, that still requires action from the legislature. So that requires an engaged public who really understands these issues and is committed to positive change for our students across the Commonwealth and really interested to keep the pressure on our legislative and governor to make sure that we get those fixes that the court may order. These are two organizations and websites that will take your email address and keep you informed about the case, about calls to action. And just some more detail at the fundourschoolspa.org website, you can volunteer to share a story. This is really powerful for those of you who have some individual examples about deficiencies in your school's or if you are aware of those schools that, you cross a particular district line and one school has significant resources and the other has significant lack of resources, to make those comparisons in a letter to an editor of your local newspaper, or to share some of that on social media, to email or other outreach to your legislators is really, we think, compelling and really helpful to keep this in the forefront of everybody's mind. And then finally, if this presentation offered something new to your understanding of the school funding system, and you think there's another group or organization in your life that would benefit, we're happy to continue sharing information. And then some contact information for us. I am going to stop my screen share and give it back to you, Susan, for any questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So we had a few questions in the chat. The first one asks about the timing of when the lawsuit is going to go to trial, and if you have any sense of when that might happen.
Oh, Michael, you're muted. We have currently, the court has set a conference for May 20th. So, that's still all we know at this stage, but we're hoping to be able to move forward in summer or fall.
Another follow-up question related to that. When the lawsuit goes to trial, will advocates be able to watch it either, depending on the COVID situation, either in person or online, or is this something where it's like all of us will be on the outside and this will happen kind of behind closed doors?
No, it's one of the wonderful things about trials in this country. They are public still. And we expect that the trial will take place after the court thinks that it is safe to have a trial in person. So much of the discovery and the depositions have actually been done virtually, but we expect that it will be a public trial in Harrisburg. And whether or not there will be a video available from it, I think will be up to PCN.
I'll note that if you use those links to sign up at fundourschoolspa.org, that's the kind of distribution list that we'll also be using to share updates. We assume like daily or regular updates about what's happening in the trial as we go forward.
Yeah.
So I want to reiterate that to everyone who's on here. We put in the Whova chat, fundourschoolspa.org. If you go to visit that, that is a website that is dedicated to the school funding lawsuit. You can sign up for updates. And then also, as Michael and Christina have said, it's going to take political will. And as advocates, we have a real job to help build political will in Pennsylvania to get our legislators to understand that we expect them to change this school funding system. So, the lawsuit is a really important piece of this whole picture, but really lawmakers need to be hearing from advocates. And I think that COVID really laid bare the disparities. And there is an understanding right now of the great and vast needs in many school districts and the injustice and the suffering, actually, like true suffering of many, many children who have been going to school for their whole lives in buildings where they have lacked even the most basic resources. So it's up to us to be able to tell these stories and to be able to make our lawmakers understand that we expect them to fix this. So really, I encourage you to go to fundourschoolspa.org and to sign up for updates. And it's pretty neat because then you'll be like, you'll know what's happening as it's happening. You'll get the updates right directly from the source. One other question was about the money that's coming in from the latest federal package. And you said that's going out through the Title I funding formula, so it will be going out, 90% of that will be going out to school districts that have the greatest need. I don't know if you want to make any other comments about that or about Governor Wolf's budget proposal. Like, does that fix this problem? Because I think state lawmakers might say, oh, school districts have so much money right now, we don't have a problem anymore. So if you'd comment on that.
Sure. The federal money comes with lots of restrictions, and frankly, we've seen this movie before. All anybody has to do is remember back to 2011 when the federal stimulus funding disappeared then, and Governor Corbett and the legislature cut over $800 million from the district funding. What's really important is not what the temporary federal funding will do with its restrictions that it's primarily supposed to go to either replace missing revenue or to provide services that otherwise are additional expenses because of the COVID crisis, and therefore doesn't solve the problem of the underfunding that currently exists between districts. You know, in the end, it is the state budget and the state priorities that really count here. That's what this lawsuit is about. The federal government is not going to do a long-term fix to this problem. And it's on all of us to try to figure out how in the world can you justify that we are spending twice as much, almost 3 times as much in some districts and in others for a child's education, for a child who's going to be participating in the same labor market in competition with the well-funded districts, students in the well-funded districts. And it's all public money, and it's all, frankly, the responsibility of the state. You know, they could change district lines. There's nothing immutable about the fact that some districts are wealthy and some districts are poor. That in the end is the situation that the state has said people need to live with, that somehow or other your zip code really is your destiny. They keep saying it shouldn't be, but they don't do something about it. And in the end, that's because it is in the legislature's self-interest not to raise state money to do the job and leave the burden on the local taxers, the school districts, who have to then bear the onus of why they're raising one of the most onerous and taxes in the state, the property tax, when the state has a much wider sources of revenue available. There was a reason that the initial Constitution in 1874 said that it actually imposed, it was one of the only states in the country to do it, imposed a minimum appropriations of $1 million. And that was because they knew the legislature did not have the desire to actually provide the tax base that was necessary to fund education. That's the underlying problem here. And that's why strong advocacy is going to be necessary even after the court, hopefully, knock on wood, tells the legislature that its current system is unconstitutional.
So just a couple things here. Fund Our Schools PA is on Facebook, so you can go to Facebook and follow them on Facebook and Instagram. If you prefer to use Twitter, you can follow Education Law Center and Public Interest Law Center on Twitter also. Those are really easy ways to just kind of get yourself in the loop to stay up with, keep up with these issues. And so I do not see any other questions in the chat, so we'll just give a minute if there's a question in the chat. And if there isn't, then I think maybe we can just thank our presenters because, you know, they are busy. I don't know how you managed to keep all of this together. It's just 100,000 pages of documents and 70 depositions is a lot. And you are small but mighty law centers that really work for the best interest of the children in our state. Okay, we have one question. What happens after this trial is over? Do you anticipate that the winner or that the loser would file an appeal?
Certainly. it's likely, unless, of course, there is a change in the legislature through the voting system. Many states actually have not appealed the initial trial court determinations and have gone forward to fix it, but it's very likely. Certainly, if we do not prevail, we will go forward to on an appeal. But I think in the end, the most important factor is whether there will be an appeal, besides whether it will be the composition of the legislature and the governorship that comes up in 2022.
Great. Excellent. I do not see any more questions in the chat. So I think we can thank you very much, Michael and Christina, for your presentation here. And then I think I will move on to doing a presentation about charter school funding so that we can kind of talk about what this part of the presentation was about the revenue that we need in our school districts. And I think I'm going to talk about the need to plug the holes in the bucket so we can keep this revenue in our school districts and it doesn't all flow out. So thank you, Michael and Christina. You were, as usual, wonderful. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. So I am Susan Spicka with the Education Voters of Pennsylvania. We are a statewide organization that focuses on building public will to secure adequate and equitable funding so that all students in Pennsylvania have an equal opportunity to learn and they have enough funding in their school districts so that they can be successful both in school and after graduation. And so, as I said before, we were hearing about the inadequate funding, so that there isn't enough revenue in our school districts to be able to support the resources that students need to learn. The other side of the equation is the expenditures and school district expenditures. And so in Pennsylvania, I'm going to start this. We have a charter school system that creates a $2.8 billion hole in the bucket. So funding goes into school districts, and we are anticipating this year that $2.8 billion will leave our school districts to go out to charter schools. And so we have a very outdated charter school tuition calculation in our state law. Charter schools were founded about well over 20 years ago. Nothing in the state law has changed. Nothing has been updated. So school districts pay tuition for each student who is enrolled in a charter school. The state formula mandates tuition rates based on the district costs minus the funding for services that charter schools don't provide. So school districts provide transportation for charter schools. So charter schools don't get a cut of school district transportation funding. Charter schools receive funding directly from the federal government. So as we see all of this federal relief, they get a share of the federal funding directly from the federal government. So they don't get a cut on top of that of the federal funding that school districts receive, because that would be a big double dip. So tuition rates take what the school district spends, subtract the costs that charters don't have and the direct funding they get from other places, divide it by the number of students in the school district, and that's your tuition rate. So there are 500 different tuition rates for 500 different schools. There's a regular education tuition rate and a special education tuition rate. The regular education tuition rate ranges from about $10,000 to $22,000 per student per year. For special education, the tuition rates increase to about $16,000 to $40,000, or even in some school districts goes up to over $50,000 per year per student in tuition that a school district will pay a charter school. Tuition rates are the same for brick and mortar charter schools and cyber charter schools, and they are not based on charter schools' actual costs, but are just based on what school districts spend. And so I guess the question is, why does this matter? Well, we can see that from 2011 to 2021, the expenditures, school district expenditures for charter schools have increased from less than $200 million to a projected nearly $2.8 billion this year in Pennsylvania. So the state provides absolutely no funding to pay for charter school tuition. That funding line item was eliminated when Governor Corbett came into office. There used to be a reimbursement for school districts that was eliminated. So school districts have to come up with $2.8 billion in funding to go to charter schools. And so our friends at the Pennsylvania Association of Business Officials found that from 2013 to 2019, when we look at property taxes, 44 cents of every new dollar raised in property taxes paid for increased charter school tuition costs in an average school district. So, you know, if people don't like property tax increases, I think we need to look at our charter school tuition rates and think about how we can right size them, because these are driving property taxes through the roof in school districts throughout the state. So first, we're going to talk about special education funding. So Pennsylvania has two separate and different funding systems for special education. For school districts, funding is based on the special education funding formula that differentiates students into three cost tiers according to their level of need. And funding goes out based on what it actually costs school districts to educate students. Charter schools, on the other hand, get funding based on a one-size-fits-all calculation that assumes 16% of each district's students receive special education services. So in 2014, the Special Education Funding Commission recommended applying the same formula to charter schools and to districts, but charter schools successfully lobbied to be exempted from the formula, and we will see why. So under the current one-size-fits-all system, charter schools are overpaid for the cost of educating students who require fewer services, and they're underpaid for the cost of students who need more services. So we can see right here, we know students with disabilities have just vastly different needs. So a student might only need a half a week of speech therapy. That might cost $15,000 a year to educate that student. Well, if a charter school accepts that student, they get the tuition rate that the school district pays. So they might typically get $27,000 a year in tuition to educate that student. So if the student has low-cost services, the charter school gets an extra $12,000 that they don't need to spend, providing services. They get to pocket that. They take special education funding from school districts, and there is no requirement that they spend special education funding on services for students. They can spend that money on anything, on CEO salaries, on advertising, on building expansion, whatever they want. On the flip side, there are students who require services that are more expensive because they have greater needs. So if there is a student who needs a full-time aide, that they might have costs that total $35,000, but the tuition rate is still just $27,000. So there is a disincentive for charter schools to admit students who have slightly greater needs because they actually aren't getting enough money in tuition to pay for those students. And so advocates for a long time have said that it seems like charter schools are gaming the system and enrolling a lot of students with low-cost services who require low-cost services for their disabilities and not enrolling students with higher-cost services. And Education Voters did a report last year where we analyzed the data of enrollment data from every charter school and every school district, and we found that there are exceptions, but overall in Pennsylvania, charter schools are vastly under-enrolling students who have disabilities that require high-cost services. So this funding system actually limits the school choice of students with disabilities who require higher services. So this is not a good system for students with disabilities. It is not a good system for school choice, and it's certainly not a good system for taxpayers. And then I just want to get into this tuition calculation and the 16% issue. Sounds a little wonky, but if you stick with me for about 2 minutes, you'll get it and you'll understand why it's such a big deal. So the tuition calculation takes the special education expenditures, divides it by the number of students in the district, and then multiplies that by 16%. They just assume that every school district has 16% of the students in their district who receive special education services. That creates the charter school tuition, or the special ed tuition portion that's added to the regular tuition rate, and then you get the charter school tuition rate in the end. The problem we have in Pennsylvania is that most school districts, in fact, we have 406 school districts, educate 16% or more of their student population receive special education. There are just 93 districts where the percentage is under 16%. And if districts have a larger percentage of students, we can think about it as a pie. So if we divide a pie into 20 pieces, the pieces are smaller than if we divide a pie into 16 pieces. So what's happening is that school districts are ending up paying charter schools more in tuition per student than they actually are having left over to spend on the students in their own district. So we find that a typical school district pays a charter school nearly 25% more per special education student on average than they spend on their own students who remain in their district schools. And I'm just going to show you this to just see what it actually looks like. So this is, we do not have a Deer Run school district. This is a made up school district, but these are real school district numbers. So if there's a school district that has 4,853 students, they have about 20% of those students receive special education services, 965 students, and their total special education spending is $14 million. When we divide the $14 million by the 965 students, we find that on average, the school district spends $14,733 per student. But that's not what they send to charter schools is their tuition. They have to use the calculation that's in the current law that assumes only 16% of their students are receiving special education services. So instead of dividing the $14 million by the real number of students, they divide the $14 million by this made up number of students that's in the tuition in the law. And when they do that, they end up getting a tuition rate of $18,000 per student. So a typical school, this is a typical district, this district would pay $3,577 more in special education funding per charter school student than it has remaining in the district to spend on its own students. So that's the special education problem. So now we're going to move on to something else here. So I guess I didn't set up the poll. I'm sorry I didn't set up the poll, but we can all just do the poll in our heads. So who said it? During the last few years, we've created a complete business ecosystem at the waterfront. This strategic purchase was the natural next step as we continue to expand our operations. So was it a casino operator, a real estate developer, the manager of a sports arena, or was it a cyber charter school CEO who said this? Well, if you guessed that it was a cyber charter school CEO, you are correct. This article came out in February. The CEO of the state's largest charter school, the Commonwealth Cyber Charter School, the Commonwealth Charter Academy, had that quote. They have bought the Macy's, the abandoned Macy's in Pittsburgh. They are renting the second floor to a client, and then they are going to use the first floor. Kind of unclear for what, because as we know, cyber charter school students, they learn at home on their computers. I don't know what they need hundreds of thousands of square feet for, but they have this building. CCA also bought an office park down in southeastern Pennsylvania earlier in the fall. And so they're kind of like building a real estate empire, I guess, not quite sure for what. And here's one more question. How much did a single cyber charter school spend on efforts to recruit students during a 3-month period in 2018? Did the school spend $10,000, $100,000, $500,000, or $850,000? If you guessed $850,000, you are correct. So Commonwealth Charter Academy, as voters did a right to know request to find out what they were spending on advertising. We found out they spent $7.9 million on advertising in 2018. Most of the documents came redacted because they said that it was a protected trade secret. They couldn't tell us how they spent the money. One single document was not redacted, and it was this one. And it reveals that over a 3-month period, they spent $850,000 on recruitment efforts. Now, $850,000 could have paid for 9 or 10 full-time teachers or nurses or guidance counselors. This is money that was taken from school districts. People paid higher property taxes to pay charter school, cyber charter tuition bills. That money was then taken and it was spent on advertising. And again, this is only a small fraction of the advertising budget for that cyber charter school that year. So when we see that we have school districts that we know, so we learned from Public Interest Law Center and Education Law Center, we've seen with our own eyes, there are school districts that don't have the funding that they need to pay for basic resources for students. Before the pandemic, they didn't have computers. They didn't even have up-to-date textbooks that are aligned to state standards so that they could even teach students, with materials that are going to help them be able to learn what they need to learn. We've got that on one hand. And on the other hand, we have cyber charter schools that have so much extra money that they can't even spend it. They have to buy buildings. They have to spend it on massive advertising budgets because they can't spend it on kids. Cyber charter schools get the same amount of money per student as brick and mortar schools. And we know they don't have the same costs. They don't have the buildings. They don't have the cleaning staff. They don't have, a huge array of different expenses that school districts have. Cyber charter schools don't have them. And we've seen as schools have transitioned to remote learning, school districts can provide very good remote learning for about $5,000 a student. So there are two funding reforms that have been proposed this year by Governor Wolf, and then there are lawmakers, bipartisan lawmakers, who are also very supportive of these funding reforms. So the first one would be to more closely match cyber charter school tuition to the actual cost of educating students at home on a computer. And so the proposal is a flat rate of $9,500 per student, which is a very generous amount of funding. The second proposal is to apply the special education funding formula to all charter schools, cyber charters and regular charter schools, so that the charter schools would receive a tuition amount that would be based on students' actual needs. So if they have low cost needs, they would receive less tuition. If they have higher cost needs, they would receive a lot more. And then there are other reforms that are proposed, including statewide performance standards for charter schools, a moratorium on new cyber charters until they improve their academic achievement, ensuring that all charters are held to the same financial and ethical standards, and greater financial oversight. And one thing that has come out recently too is that cyber charter schools are not audited regularly. Half of the cyber charter schools have never been audited by the state. The largest one, CCA, which is expected to bring in $270 million in state revenue and our local property tax dollars, they haven't been audited since 2012. So there's virtually no oversight over any of the dollars flowing into the cyber charter schools in Pennsylvania, and that is a very serious problem because when they have so much money and nobody's watching how they spend it, it leaves open vast opportunities for waste, fraud, and abuse. And so there are definitely good charter schools out there that do a very good job for students. They shouldn't have a problem with any of these things being enacted because they're playing by the rules. It's the people who aren't playing by the rules, who are doing shenanigans with the funding. We need to tighten this up so that we can ensure that these tax dollars are being spent in the way that they're supposed to be spent. So that's my presentation about cyber charter schools and charter school funding reform. If you want to learn more about Education Voters, you can visit educationvoterspa.org. And my name is Susan Spicka. There's my contact information. I am always happy to talk to people about any of these issues. And this is just one little tiny piece of the work that we do. So we do a lot of other work on funding and equitable funding, the need for, just the vast needs in our school districts and how we can support our getting this funding that they need. So I'm wondering if anybody has questions. Do we have any questions that we see? I don't see anything in the chat. I do know that I can send the slides to the PVPC team for both presentations, and we can send those out if that's possible.
Susan, this is
Yep.
Jeff. We have the PDF of the initial slides about the lawsuit is already available on the HUBA app on the Pennsylvania Budget Summit webpage, so folks can access that PDF there. And if you send yours over to me, I'll add those to that, and folks can access them directly off of the Budget Summit webpage.
Great. So I'll get you the slides for the charter school stuff, and you can have that too. But I don't know if there are any other questions. Do not see any.
Susan, this is Adrienne from the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. We had someone ask in the chat if they're able to access these presentations afterwards, if they missed the beginning, or if maybe they also wanted to check out what was happening with the housing section. I just wanted to note that we are going to be uploading those into the video gallery. It'll take a little bit to upload, but they will be there later today, so you can watch or rewatch any of the sessions.
Great. And I see a question here from Ronald, and it says, all cyber charter schools are authorized by the state. Why has PDE not required an audit, and why don't they pull their authorization if they're failing? So this gets into another problem that we have with the charter school law in terms of the authorization. We have what's called a charter school appeal board. So if there at any any part of the process, either a charter school being approved or a charter school having its charter renewed, if the charter school doesn't like the outcome, they can appeal to the Charter Appeals Board, which is an unelected bureaucratic body that's in Harrisburg. And it is a long and arduous process to go through the appeal process. And the Charter Appeal Board, sometimes, you know, it's a very political body. And so I understand that the state has been working on the authorizations of the cyber charter schools. They have kind of small staff. So the PDE has been, the Pennsylvania Department of Education has been very underfunded. And so going through this process is a lot. And then on top of that, they know that there's going to be an appeal if they try to take a charter away from a cyber charter school. And so there is that process. And I do think cyber charter schools' performance is so abysmal. You know, a lot of students have transferred to cyber charter schools this year because school districts went to remote learning. Cyber charter schools jumped in and said, we are great at educating students online. We've done this forever. Here, let us send you a box of goodies. And so there's been a massive increase in enrollment in cyber charter schools. And I don't think that's anything anybody should celebrate, because although cyber charter schools have been around for a long time, what study after study after study has found is that when you look at the academic achievement of students in cyber charter schools, they fall behind their peers who remain in district schools. So a recent study from last year from Stanford University found that students who attended cyber charter schools lost 118 days of instruction in math compared to students who remained in school districts, and 106 days of instruction of learning, I should say, in English. And so there's no reason to celebrate students going there. I think that the authorization process needs to be improved. And I think PDE needs to be able to hold them more accountable. But part of being able to hold them accountable is creating better accountability in the law, so that if a charter is denied, it can be denied and we can move on, and we're not just stuck in an appeals process for 5 years with the charter school fighting to get itself open. And I think it's the Auditor General's office that has to decide that it's going to audit. So we have a new Auditor General this year, and I am very hopeful that he will make it a priority, because school districts are mercilessly audited. Every 3 years, every school district has an auditor come in and go through their books. There is no reason that cyber charter schools should get special treatment and you know, like the special carve out that they get to just spend billions of dollars with no one understanding how it's spent. So hoping that the new Auditor General will take that up and take seriously holding these schools accountable. So I'm just going to read this out loud. It sounds like a lot of the issues with cyber charters center on unethical companies. Are their charters doing good work with the funding they have, who might be harmed by the reforms targeting unethical companies? So, you know, I think that the charter schools that are doing a good job, that are playing by the rules, they're not going to have any problem with additional accountability measures for their finances. They're playing by the rules. They're spending the money the way that they should. Schools that are enrolling larger numbers of students with disabilities who require more services, they will get actually more special education funding for those students than they get right now. So the special education funding for schools that are actually enrolling students with significant needs should shake out in a way that works for them. If there are charter schools that are enrolling only students who have low-cost disabilities, and they are relying on the excess special education funding that they get from districts to pad their budgets or to run their schools, those schools are going to have to adjust to the new reality of getting paid based on a formula that's based on need. There is no school that should be taking special education funding that has been raised at the local level from local taxpayers and reallocating that to pay for other things in their schools. That's not how the system is intended to work. So, you know, I would say, like, ethically run charter schools that are doing the right thing for kids should not be hurt by these reforms. Yes, and I understand, and just because it's long and political doesn't mean it should not be done in terms of like reauthorizing and authorizing the charter schools. So I think that the cyber charter schools are all in a series, it's all a process, right? So PDE is looking at them and using standards, And part of the issue is we've had the academic standards have been changed. So we went from having one set of academic standards to another set of academic standards. And I think that the ground keeps shifting. But with this recent incredibly huge enrollment of students in the cyber charter schools, I think that we're going to probably see some action on holding them more accountable. And I think it's been, the Biden administration decided not to cancel standardized testing for this year, but allowed states, if they wanted to defer it to the fall. And I think that while standardized testing has a lot of flaws and there are a lot of downsides to it, one thing it does is it does let us know where students are being successful and where they're not being successful, so that interventions can be made, right? So that interventions, we can say, like, these are the schools that are struggling and these are the schools that need help. So I agree that we need to have more accountability for these cyber charter schools, especially since they're enrolling so many students and the stakes for the state are very, very high. So I do not see other questions in the chat. Is there anyone who has a question? Because you could just put it in there, and if not, I think that I will be just very happy to say thank you very much for attending today. It was lovely to have people here. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Love the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. I'm amazed at the people, everyone who's working behind the scenes that you can't even see today. All of the people who have put together this virtual online summit are pretty amazing people, both in terms of their technical abilities and then in terms of the work they do with PBPC. And I just, none of this, we would not make progress in Pennsylvania if it weren't for the advocates who are out there every day engaging in issues from education to housing to everything else that we need to do. So I just want to say thank you very much for attending today. And, it's educationvoterspa.org. If you want to learn more, you can sign up for updates. And just thank you very much.
Susan, one other announcement quickly here before we wrap up. I'm going to let folks know that we have resources from this workshop and from every workshop available on the Summit webpage. One of those resources is a form where you can give us some feedback. We'd really appreciate you taking just a minute or two to go onto the Budget Summit website and give us a little bit of feedback about this session, what you enjoyed about it, what you appreciated about it, suggestions that you have, and you'll be able to help us continue to improve and build these sessions. So again, just take a moment or two to fill out that survey. We'll also be doing some great workshops 2 weeks from, not 2 weeks, 1 week from today. Next Thursday at 1 o'clock, we will be doing 2 workshops for about an hour and 15 minutes those days. Starting at 1 o'clock next Thursday, March 25th, we'll be having a workshop towards racial equity in Pennsylvania's public policy and supporting campaigns for immigrants' rights in Pennsylvania. So be sure to join us next Thursday at 1 p.m. The following Thursday, April 1st, we'll be doing 2 more workshops that week, and we'll have a closing plenary, which will be a legislative panel discussion. So please join us for that, and go to the website to check out videos, other resources, and complete that survey for today's workshop session. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.